The night Mary Beth's daughters came into the world was supposed to be a moment of blessing. The small frontier cabin had echoed with the cries of labor, the low voice of the midwife urging her to push, and finally, the frail wails of newborn life. Yet instead of joy, the room filled with silence heavy, damning silence, as the midwife wrapped the third baby in a thin cloth and stared at Mary Beth with wide, troubled eyes. 3 girls, the woman whispered, her voice carrying the weight of judgment. All 3. Girls. The word stung sharper than the pain of childbirth. Mary Beth, exhausted, clutched at the nearest bundle, pressing her lips against the baby's soft head. They were perfect tiny fingers curling like promises, eyes squinting against the dim lantern light. But she saw the shadow fall across her father's face, saw the scowl deepen in her brother's eyes as they looked upon her daughters. Her father spat on the floorboards. "Cursed," he muttered. "A womb that brings no sons is a burden. And 3 mouths to feed, all useless girls." Mary Beth's heart clenched. "They are my children," she protested weakly. "They are blessings, every one of them," but her words fell like pebbles against stone. The men would not listen. On the frontier, survival was measured in strength, and strength was measured in sons. Daughters were seen as extra mouths to feed, as dowries to worry about, as nothing more than fragile burdens. And Mary Beth, already a widow with no husband to defend her, had no voice loud enough to defy their cruelty. By dawn, her fate was sealed. She was given a threadbare blanket, a half-empty water jug, and nothing more. Her kin dragged her out into the pale morning light, the cries of her babies piercing the chill. The townsfolk watched from doorways and windows, whispering as she stumbled past. Some pitied her, some sneered, but none reached out to stop what was happening. Her brother sneered as he shoved her toward the edge of the settlement. "Go find someone else to feed your cursed spawn. You're not our problem anymore." Mary Beth's legs trembled beneath her as she clutched all 3 swaddled infants to her chest. Their tiny cries were muffled against her dress, and she bent her head to whisper to them, her own tears wetting their blankets. "Hush now, my loves. Mama's here. I won't let them take you from me. I won't." The wilderness beyond the settlement loomed vast and unwelcoming. The prairie stretched into endless distance, dotted with scraggly shrubs and wind-bent trees. To be turned out with no food, no shelter, and 3 newborns was as good as a death sentence. Yet Mary Beth had no choice but to keep walking, her body still aching from labor, her steps faltering with every mile. The sun rose higher, beating down without mercy. Her lips cracked, her throat dry, she stumbled on, cradling her daughters against her like treasures. At times she thought of lying down beneath the trees, letting the earth swallow her and her little ones together. But each time one of the babies whimpered, and it sparked a fire deep inside her chest. "They'll not win," she whispered hoarsely. "You are not curses. You are my whole heart." She pressed her cheek against the top of her eldest's head, though she could not yet tell them apart. Each one was precious, each one hers. By nightfall, the prairie winds grew cold, cutting through her thin dress. Her hands trembled as she tried to shield the babies with the worn blanket, but she knew it was not enough. She sank to her knees, rocking them, the stars beginning to blink into existence above her. Despair gnawed at her bones, and a sob tore from her throat, raw and broken. "Please," she begged the night, the heavens, the God she wasn't sure still listened. "Please don't let them die. Take me if you must, but let them live." The wind stirred, rustling the grass. Mary Beth hugged her daughters tighter, unaware that in the distance, a pair of watchful eyes had been following her since she was cast out. A silent figure stood at the edge of the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, his face carved with solemn lines. He had seen cruelty before, seen how the white settlers turned against their own when weakness was perceived. But this, This mother cast out for the sin of birthing daughters pulled at something deeper within him. He did not move, not yet. But the night was long, and Mary Beth was not as alone as she believed. The prairie was not kind to the desperate. Its vastness swallowed sound, light, and hope, leaving only the endless sweep of grass and sky. Mary Beth trudged forward through it, clutching her daughters with the last of her strength. Her breaths came shallow, each step heavier than the last. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. To stop meant death, but death lingered close anyway. What she did not see, what her exhausted eyes could not catch, was the figure who had been shadowing her since she was driven from the settlement. Dakota moved like part of the land itself. His moccasins pressed into the soil without sound, his dark hair tied back, his shoulders draped in a blanket that blended with the muted colors of the prairie. He was tall, with the bearing of someone who had seen battle and grief alike, yet his movements were patient, almost reverent, as he trailed the fragile woman staggering ahead of him. He had first seen her when the settlers cast her out, her cries carrying across the wind. He had not intervened, then interference often brought blood. But something about her struck him. Perhaps it was the sight of the 3 tiny swaddled infants in her arms, their lives so new and fragile. Perhaps it was the way she held them, fiercely protective even in her weakness. Or perhaps it was the memory of loss etched into his own bones, the memory of a family buried by violence and hunger, leaving him with silence as his closest companion. Dakota did not trust the settlers. He had watched them long enough to know their cruelty, their rigid laws, their blindness to what was sacred. To cast out a mother for birthing daughters? To treat life as curse instead of gift? It was beyond his comprehension. Mary Beth stumbled. One of the babies whimpered, the soft, pitiful cry piercing the dusk. Dakota's hand twitched at his side, instinct urging him forward. But he held back, watching. She fell to her knees, clutching the infants tighter, rocking them as her sobs broke into the open air. The sound made something inside Dakota tighten, like a cord pulled too taut. She was a creature of raw pain and raw love all at once, and he could not look away. The prairie wind gusted, carrying her broken whisper to him. Please, God, help us. Don't let them take my girls. Her plea was not to him, yet it reached him all the same. Dakota closed his eyes, the weight of her suffering settling into his chest. He thought of turning back, of leaving her to the fate her people had chosen for her. That would have been easier, safer. But as the minutes stretched on, and as the moonlight caught the shimmer of her tears, he knew he would not. He waited until the babies settled into a weary, fretful silence in their mother's arms. Then, as quietly as the wind itself, he stepped closer. Mary Beth stiffened. She felt him before she saw him, a presence vast and solemn in the night. Her heart lurched in terror out here alone. Who else could it be but a raider, a thief, or worse? She clutched her daughters tighter, raising her head with trembling defiance, and then she saw him. The Apache stood several paces away, tall and still, the starlight outlining his figure. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark and steady as they rested on her. He did not move closer, but he did not leave. Mary Beth's throat tightened. She had heard stories of the Apache wild tales spun by settlers of savagery and cruelty. Yet as she looked at him, there was no malice in his gaze. Only watchfulness. Only silence. Her lips trembled as she whispered, Please, don't hurt my babies. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, slowly, Dakota extended his hand. Not in threat, not to take, but to offer. His palm faced upward, open, steady in the night air. Mary Beth's eyes widened, confusion warring with fear. He said nothing, no words of explanation, no demand. Just the quiet offer of his hand, as if to say, You do not have to fall alone. Her tears blurred her vision. She did not know if she could trust him. But she also knew she had nothing left, no strength, no shelter, no kin. And in the stillness of his silence, she felt something she had not felt in months: hope. For a long moment, the night stretched between them, her fear, his silence, and the faint whimper of newborns bundled in her arms. Mary Beth stared at the Apache's hand, extended toward her, palm open. It was a gesture so simple, yet it cut through her terror. He had not spoken, not advanced on her, not reached for her children. He simply waited, steady as stone, her heart hammered in her chest. She was torn between instinct and desperation. Settlers had filled her head with warnings about his people, how they were fierce, merciless, untrustworthy. But her kin, her own flesh and blood, had cast her out without pity. Who was more dangerous now, the strangers she had feared, or the family that had abandoned her? One of the babies stirred, a thin cry rising into the cold night. Mary Beth's body quivered as she tried to hush her daughters, rocking them gently against her chest. Her arms ached, her back screamed from the strain, yet she clung to them as though letting go would mean their death. The Apache took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. Moonlight caught the strong lines of his face, stoic, unreadable, but not cruel. His dark eyes flicked to the babies, then back to her. His silence was unsettling, yet in it there was no malice. Her breath hitched as she whispered, I can't carry them much farther." She had not meant to say it aloud, but the truth tumbled from her like water breaking through a cracked dam. Exhaustion had stripped her bare, leaving only honesty in its wake. She felt her knees give way, and she sank into the grass, clutching her daughters tighter, terrified that weakness would cost them their lives. The Apache crouched in front of her, slow enough for her to draw back if she wished. His hand remained outstretched, steady, patient. For a moment, Mary Beth thought he might finally speak. But he didn't. Instead, he shifted, reached down, and touched one of the baby's blankets with surprising gentleness. Her breath caught. He was careful, his large hand brushing the soft cloth as though testing her trust. Then, with a small nod, he slid his arms beneath one of the infants and lifted her. Mary Beth gasped and almost cried out, but stopped when she saw how carefully he held the child. His strong hands, scarred from work and survival, cradled the tiny girl as though she were made of glass. He adjusted the swaddling, tucked the edge closer against the baby's cheek, and settled her against his chest. The infant, instead of wailing, quieted almost instantly. Mary Beth's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how badly her arms ached until the weight was lifted from her, even slightly. But more than relief, she felt a shock of something she hadn't known she could feel: safety. Her gaze flicked to his face. He didn't meet her eyes. His attention was on the baby in his arms. The silence remained, but it was no longer unsettling. It was protective. Mary Beth's tears slipped down her cheeks, unbidden. I thought they were all against us. But you," her voice broke, her words dissolving into sobs. She buried her face against the heads of her other two daughters, whispering to them through tears, "You're not curses. You're not. You're loved." The Apache finally lifted his gaze, meeting hers. For the first time, she thought she saw something in those dark eyes, an echo of understanding, of pain carried silently, of grief and strength interwoven. He didn't speak, not yet. But he didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words. Together they rose from the grass, she with two babies, he with one. For the first time since her exile, Mary Beth did not feel entirely alone. As they walked into the night, her steps steadied. She still feared what tomorrow would bring, still knew the world was cruel. But there, beside the silent Apache who carried her child as though she were his own, she felt a flicker of hope she thought had died forever. The prairie stretched vast and endless. But under the silent Apache's guidance, Mary Beth no longer felt lost. She walked in step with him, clutching two of her daughters close to her chest while he carried the third with quiet ease. The baby lay nestled against his broad shoulder, tiny breath steady, as if she had never known fear at all. Mary Beth's heart clenched each time she looked at him. His silence remained unbroken, yet his presence radiated assurance. She had lived her whole life among people who used words like weapons, sharp, cruel, dismissive. Yet here was a man who spoke not with his tongue, but with his actions. And somehow his silence was louder than all the voices that had condemned her. The hours stretched as they walked. Mary Beth's legs trembled, her body still weak from childbirth, but each time she faltered, the Apache adjusted his pace. He never rushed her, never scolded, never showed impatience. His steady rhythm anchored her when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her at last. When the moon hung high in silver, he led her off the open plain toward a rocky outcropping. Massive stone cliffs rose like the bones of the earth itself, jagged and imposing, yet offering something she hadn't dared hope for. Shelter. The Apache climbed the slope with practiced ease, pausing only to make sure she could follow. Mary Beth hesitated, staring at the steep path, then tightened her hold on her daughters and began the climb. Her breath came ragged, her arms ached, but desperation fueled her. The babies needed warmth, safety, life. When she stumbled, he extended a hand, steadying her without a word. His grip was firm, grounding, and when she looked up, their eyes met for the briefest of moments. Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement, perhaps even trust. Finally, they reached a narrow ledge that opened into a hollow in the rock. Mary Beth gasped. It was no crude shelter, it was a hidden refuge. A small fire pit lay at the center, stones carefully arranged, with stacked firewood beside it. Furs were piled in one corner, clean and neatly arranged. The faint scent of smoke lingered, evidence of a life lived quietly, apart from the world. The Apache stepped inside first, setting down the infant he carried onto the furs. The baby stirred but did not cry, her small hand curling into the blanket. Mary Beth followed, lowering herself with her other two daughters. For the first time since her exile, she felt walls around her, something stronger than the prairie wind to shield them. He knelt by the fire pit, striking flint until sparks caught the kindling. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, chasing away the chill. Mary Beth held her daughters closer, the warmth seeping into their blankets, into her weary bones. She exhaled a trembling sigh, tears welling in her eyes. The Apache rose and moved with quiet efficiency, fetching water from a small jug, preparing a pot above the fire, and adding strips of dried meat and herbs. The savory scent filled the hollow, rich and earthy. Mary Beth's stomach tightened painfully. She had not eaten in more than a day. When he finally turned, he carried a small bowl of broth. He did not thrust it at her, nor did he command her to eat. Instead, he crouched before her, set the bowl within her reach, and nodded once as if to say, "This is for you. Take it if you will." Mary Beth's hands trembled as she accepted it. The steam warmed her face, the liquid sliding down her throat like life itself. Tears burned in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. His silence remained, but his eyes lingered on her, on the way she hunched protectively around her daughters, on the exhaustion etched in her face. Then he turned back to the fire, lifting one of the babies with surprising gentleness. He shifted the child against his shoulder, rocking her slowly, his deep chest rising and falling in rhythm. Mary Beth stared, her breath caught in her throat. The image of this solemn, silent man and Apache her people had taught her to fear, cradling her daughter as if she were his own. It unraveled her. Her heart whispered a truth she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Here, In this shelter carved beneath the sky, she and her daughters might have found the protection they had been denied. The fire burned low, its glow casting soft shadows on the stone walls of the hollow. Outside, the prairie winds howled, but within there was warmth. The babies slept at last, bundled in furs, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. The quiet should have brought peace, yet Mary Beth's heart was far from calm. She sat close to the flames, her knees drawn up, her hands trembling as they hovered above the warmth. She felt hollowed out, her body aching from childbirth, her spirit battered from exile. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The Apache, her silent savior, sat nearby, cross-legged, his dark gaze fixed on the flames. He had spoken no word since he'd appeared, but his presence filled the space as surely as the fire's glow. He was a man carved from stone and shadow, his silence not empty but purposeful, like a vow. Mary Beth glanced at him, then quickly away. She felt the urge to speak building within her chest, desperate to spill the torment she had carried alone for so long. Yet fear held her back. What right did she have to pour her heart into the quiet of this stranger? And yet, he had carried her child, led her to shelter, given her food, warmth, safety. If she could not speak here, then where? Her voice came soft at first, like a fragile thread. They called me cursed. The Apache's gaze did not shift, but she felt the weight of his attention settle on her. They said daughters are nothing but burdens. That 3 girls at once was a punishment from God. Her voice cracked, and she clutched her arms tighter around herself. But when I look at them, when I hold them, I see only love. I see blessings. Tears blurred her vision. She blinked them away, staring into the fire. Still, I can't help but wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was meant to be cast out. Maybe I'll only doom my girls by trying to keep them alive. Her words dissolved into a choked sob. She buried her face in her hands, ashamed of her weakness yet unable to stop. The babies stirred faintly at her sound, but the fire's warmth lulled them back into sleep. The silence stretched again, thick, suffocating. She half expected him to remain still, to ignore her confession as the others had. But then something shifted. A deep breath, steady and deliberate. The Apache turned his head, his dark eyes finding hers in the dim light, and then, for the first time, he spoke. "They are blessings," he said, his voice low, gravelly from disuse, but soft. His words, though few, carried a weight that struck her harder than any sermon or lecture ever had. "Not curses," Mary Beth froze. The sound of his voice was unexpected, startling in its gentleness. She lifted her head, staring at him through her tears. You spoke." He gave a small nod, as if words were precious things he did not spend lightly. His gaze shifted to the 3 infants sleeping soundly between them. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that made her chest tighten. "They are life," he whispered, as if speaking to himself as much as to her. "Life is never curse." Mary Beth's throat closed, her tears spilling freely now. No one had defended her children, not once, not the midwife, not her father, not even her brother. But here, in this hidden refuge, a man who owed her nothing had broken his silence to declare them worthy. Her hands shook as she reached for the nearest baby, tucking the fur closer around her tiny body. She whispered, half to the child and half to him, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing them as I do." The Apache did not answer again, but he didn't need to. His eyes softened, his presence a shield against the world that had turned her away. That night, as the fire dimmed and the prairie winds howled outside, Mary Beth felt something she had not felt since before her exile. She felt seen. And for the first time, she dared to believe that hope was not gone forever. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Mary Beth had never known quiet, steady, unspoken. The prairie outside the hollow was harsh, But within their hidden shelter, life began to take on a fragile shape of its own. Dakota rose with the dawn, moving like part of the earth itself, silent and sure. Each morning, he left with his bow and returned with rabbits, fish, or strips of dried venison he had stored away. He gathered herbs, fetched water, and laid the food before her without ceremony. He did not ask for thanks, nor expect it. His silence had become something Mary Beth understood. He did not need to speak, because his actions spoke louder. Mary Beth, for her part, found herself wanting to give back. She boiled water over the fire, washed the cloths used for the babies, and learned to brew teas from the herbs he brought. She tended to the furs, shook them clean, and stitched at tears with what little thread she had. Each small act steadied her heart, reminding her she was not just surviving, she was building something. However, fragile. Her daughters thrived under Dakota's quiet guardianship. Though his large hands seemed built for weapons and work, he cradled the babies with startling gentleness. He would hold one as Mary Beth nursed another, his broad chest serving as a pillow where tiny heads rested without fear. The baby's cries often stilled faster in his arms than in her own, something that both astonished and comforted her. One evening, Mary Beth watched as he sat cross-legged near the fire, her youngest tucked against his shoulder. He was humming soft, almost too low to hear a tune that seemed older than the stones around them. She froze, listening, her breath caught in her chest. It was the first sound she had heard from him besides those rare words, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. "You've held children before," she said softly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes flickered, shadows crossing them. For a moment she thought he would retreat into silence, but then he nodded once, slowly. "My own," he said. His voice rough, her heart ached. She did not press him with questions. The grief in that small confession was heavy enough. She only bowed her head and whispered, "I'm sorry." He gave no reply, but she noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze lingered on the infant in his arms. It was a look that mingled sorrow and fierce protection, as though these little girls were threads stitching together something broken in him. As the days turned to weeks, Mary Beth began to feel the edges of her fear soften. At first, she had trembled at every shadow, convinced raiders or settlers would find them and finish what her family had begun. But Dakota's presence anchored her. Each time he stepped outside, she knew he would return. Each time he looked at her daughters, she knew he would not let harm come to them. Slowly, she came to see not just the silent Apache, but the man beneath. He was scarred, yes, by hardship, by loss, but he was also patient, steady, and kind in ways words could never capture. One night, as she lay beside her daughters while Dakota tended the fire, she whispered, "I used to think silence meant cruelty. That when no one spoke for me, it meant no one cared. But now, your silence feels different." He glanced at her, the firelight catching in his eyes. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice quiet as wind over grass. "Words are easy. Deeds are truth." Mary Beth swallowed hard. She had lived her whole life among people whose words promised one thing and delivered another. In Dakota, she found the opposite: no promises, only proof. The fire crackled between them, warm and steady. She looked at him, at the man who had become the protector of her daughters, the anchor of her days. And for the first time, she let the thought take root fully in her heart. Perhaps this exile was not the end of her story. Perhaps it was the beginning of a new one. A bond was forming between them, not through declarations or grand gestures, but through hardship shared, through small mercies repeated, through the silent language of survival. And though she did not yet know what shape it would take, she knew one thing with certainty: she was no longer alone. The morning was sharp with the bite of autumn, frost tracing silver across the grass outside the hollow. Mary Beth had just finished feeding her daughters when the sound of voices carried on the wind. Harsh, clipped tones. Not Dakota's calm silence, no. This was the rough speech of men who thought themselves masters of the prairie. Her blood ran cold. Dakota was out gathering firewood, and she was alone with the girls. She snatched them up, clutching one to her chest while the other two whimpered on the furs beside her. Fear knifed through her belly. She had not seen her kin since the night they had thrown her out, but the voices were too close to mistake. Reckon she died already, one of them laughed. Wouldn't be surprised. Couldn't even give a man a son. Still, if she's around, we ought to make sure. Can't have her crawling back begging? Tears burned Mary Beth's eyes, but she pressed them down. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The shadows lengthened across the mouth of the hollow, and then they appeared 3 settlers, faces she knew well. One was her cousin, the very man who had dragged her by the arm and thrown her into the night with her newborns. His eyes lit up with cruel triumph when he saw her huddled there, babes in arms. Well, well, he drawled. Ain't this a sight? She's still breathin', he spat in the dirt. Guess misery's harder to kill than we thought. The other man chuckled. One leaned against the rocks, staring at her daughters. 3 of them. All girls. Burden on the land just like their mama. Mary Beth's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to claw at them, but fear for her babies held her still. Then before she could answer, before they could take another step, Dakota emerged from the trees. Silent as always, but his presence filled the clearing like thunderclouds gathering on the horizon. His arms were full of firewood, which he dropped to the ground without a word. His gaze swept the settlers, dark and unreadable, before settling on Mary Beth. For a moment, she thought she saw reassurance flicker in his eyes, a promise, unspoken, that she was safe. The settlers stiffened. One muttered, "Apache." His hand went for the knife at his belt. Dakota did not move quickly. He didn't need to. He stepped forward, tall and unyielding, his shadow falling over the men who only minutes ago had sneered at Mary Beth's weakness. Now their laughter faltered. Mary Beth watched, her heart pounding. She expected Dakota to speak, to demand they leave, but he did not waste words. He simply planted himself between her and them, shoulders squared, jaw set like stone. His silence was heavier than any shout could have been. Her cousin tried to muster bravado. "She don't belong to you?" he spat. "She's kin. Our problem to deal with." Dakota's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached behind him and laid his bow across his shoulder, slow and deliberate. His other hand rested against the knife at his belt. He did not raise them, he didn't need to. The warning was clear. 1 step closer, and you will regret it. The settlers faltered. Mary Beth could feel the shift, like the air before a storm. These men, so cruel when she was alone, now faced someone they could not intimidate. Their jeers withered into mutters. One tried to laugh, but it sounded brittle. Finally, her cousin spat in the dirt again. "Ain't worth it," he growled, glaring at Mary Beth with hate that cut deeper than words. "Right here, then. You and your bastard girls." With that, he turned, jerking his head for the others to follow. Their boots crunched against the frost as they retreated. Their bravado shattered in the face of one man's silent defiance, Mary Beth's. Hands trembled as she held her daughters close. When the last of their footsteps faded, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Dakota turned then, looking at her. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something fierce, something protective. He crouched beside her, brushing his hand gently across the brow of the baby she held. "You are safe," he said, his voice low, the words carrying more weight than any oath. Tears slipped down Mary Beth's cheeks. For the first time since her exile, she truly believed it. The fire burned low that night, its embers glowing like faint stars against the dark walls of the hollow. Mary Beth sat close, her daughters nestled in sleep beside her. Outside, the prairie lay in silence, as if holding its breath after the day's storm. The settlers were gone, but their words still echoed in her mind venom meant to wound. And yet, she was still here. Her girls were still here. And it was because of him. Dakota sat a little apart, sharpening the edge of his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythm was steady, like a heartbeat, filling the quiet between them. Mary Beth watched him, her chest tightening with feelings she could no longer ignore. For weeks, he had given her strength without asking for anything in return. He had carried wood, hunted food, rocked her daughters to sleep, and stood against the men who had cast her out. He had shielded her with his silence and his presence, and in doing so, he had shown her more care than anyone in her own family ever had. Her throat ached with words she hadn't dared to speak. Fear had always stopped her fear of rejection, of misunderstanding, of hope itself. But tonight, after what had happened, she could not hold them back. "Dakota," she whispered. He lifted his head, pausing in his work. His dark eyes found hers, steady and waiting. He did not rush her, as he never did. She swallowed hard. "All my life, I've been told I wasn't enough. Not strong enough, not worthy enough, not the right kind of mother." Her gaze dropped to the babies, their tiny chests rising and falling in sleep. "They threw me away because I gave birth to daughters. My own kin thought me worthless." Her voice broke, but she forced herself on. "But you never looked at me like that." "Not once." Dakota said nothing. He only set the knife aside and leaned forward, his gaze unflinching, as if every word mattered. Mary Beth wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "You've carried us when I couldn't walk. You've kept us alive when I had nothing to give. And when those men came today, you stood in front of us as if we were your own." Her breath trembled. "I don't know why you did it, but you've given me more than I ever dreamed of having. Safety, dignity, hope." Her voice softened to almost nothing. "And I can't help but feel—" She hesitated, the words terrifying and fragile. "I can't help but feel I belong here. With you." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching long enough for her heart to hammer with doubt. She feared she had overstepped, that she had broken whatever fragile bond they had built. But then, slowly, Dakota reached out. His hand, rough and scarred from years of hardship, took hers with a gentleness that nearly undid her. He held it, firm and steady, as if anchoring her to the earth itself. "You are not worthless," he said at last, his voice low, each word shaped with care. "You are strong, stronger than those who cast you out. You brought life into this world and fought to keep it alive. That is worth more than all their sons." Mary Beth's breath hitched. Tears spilled freely now, but they were not only of grief, they were of release, of something beginning to heal inside her. Dakota's thumb brushed lightly against the back of her hand. He did not let go. His gaze softened, and though he spoke few words, they carried all the weight of his heart. "You belong here with me." Her chest swelled, breaking open with the fragile, terrifying beauty of hope. She leaned forward, her forehead brushing his in a gesture both tender and desperate. "Then let me stay," she whispered. "Not because I must, but because I choose to. For me, for my daughters, for us." The fire crackled, sending sparks upward into the night, as if the stars themselves bore witness. In that moment, the hollow was no longer a place of exile. It was a beginning, a sanctuary built from silence, from hardship, from two broken souls who had found each other and discovered something neither had thought possible, love born not of words, but of deeds, of trust, of whispered hope. And as Mary Beth drifted to sleep that night with Dakota's hand still holding hers, she knew she was no longer cast out. She was home.